Well, somebody messed up, didn't they? They let that crazy, wild-eyed conspiracy theorist Bill Smith have a sermon. Remember that old movie, Risky Business? It's like the parents are out of town. The keys are in the Porsche. So where do you guys want to go today? What shall we talk about? The Jesuits? COVID? National politics? Church politics? Or how about my children's personal favorite, the Hegelian dialectic, for those of you who know what that is? I know poor Adventist risk management must be very, very nervous right now. They probably think this is the shaking. So I guess we better play it safe and pray, huh? Let's pray. Please bow your heads. Thank you, Lord, for this opportunity to worship together. Lord, you know the message that I've prepared, and I pray that you would take control of me, that you would send your Spirit to fill me, you would dispel the enemy, and fill this place with the holy angels. And please give each person here the message that they need personally. Please lift everyone here up and take us to heavenly places. In Jesus' name, amen. You know, it's funny, I was thinking not that long ago that when I first came into the church about 30 years ago, I fancied myself an artist. I really would have liked to have become someone of note, a photographer or a graphic designer that was somebody. But over the years, I've become something of a church historian. And some people might think that's a relegation, but I've come to be comfortable with it. My online photography and YouTube goes back to about 2004, and most of the stuff that was captured was either captured here or at the various churches around town, or around the Triad area, I should say, I'm sorry. I was asked to give a testimony this morning, and it will be something like that, but those of you who know me know that I don't do convention very well, so it will be sort of like that. Maybe I'll come back at some point and give a more complete backstory, but the more and the less of it, just in brief, is in 1988, I was enrolled at the NC State University School of Engineering. I was in mechanical engineering. I was in the process of transferring into aerospace. I would have liked to have designed spaceships, airplanes, things like that. I kind of had that sort of interest. But I was bored with school and I dropped out. And I dropped out to pursue music. I had been playing with small local bands, and I just kind of had this idea, maybe I'll see how far I can go with that. So in 1991, I hooked up with a band that was playing the southeastern United States. I was traveling from city to city, and that particular venture ran out of money in 1994, and about 2 years later, I came into the Adventist Church. We're currently in the Thanksgiving season, and I thought it might be more appropriate to reflect on some of my experiences since entering the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and recognize a few people who were instrumental in bringing me through the door, and others who have encouraged me through the years to celebrate the times here, that mostly in Greensboro, but also in the broader Adventist community here and various other places. I also wanted this to be something of a torch passing to the next generation, to give them a small perspective on this district's history and how it is an integral part of the larger scope of Adventism, in hopes that they will understand and appreciate the potential part that they might play and in continuing the Protestant Reformation, which is not finished yet. Our individual testimonies are like small streams of light which lead to God's great ocean of truth. And even though we might be tempted to think that our small, insignificant, short lives may not amount to very much in the grand scheme, we should remember that it is the story of individuals who allowed God to take control of their lives that make up the collective history of the Bible and create the great cloud of witnesses that is delineated in Hebrews 11. Remember that it is those who ignore history who are doomed to repeat it. And this world is doomed, in large part because of its willing ignorance of the history of the great controversy, or at the very least, because its preoccupation with self-centered non-essentials to the neglect of the broader scope of the spiritual reality of where time is taking us to the final judgment and eternity beyond. But let me first say a very heartfelt thank you to your pastor, Brian Heineman, who I understand is not here, but he is an avid student of history and would appreciate all of this. And I'd also like to thank the district in general, and I mean the various people that exist here, who they were, who they are now. This is where I came into the Adventist message, probably between 25 and 30 years ago. My first contact with Adventism was my wife, Julie, and I'm certainly very thankful for her, and I know she loves it when I mention her publicly. We met while working together in the graphic design business. She is a fourth-generation Adventist. I'm a convert, so we have a very unique perspective on the church. Her great-grandparents were Jewish converts. They were baptized here in Greensboro before there was a building. They were charter members of the Greensboro Church. Julie was not attending church when we met, but she had grown up with what we sometimes lovingly refer to as the Adventist bubble. She had attended Tri-City and Mount Pisgah Academies and had become a little bit jaded with the church in general through some of her experiences. About a year or so into our relationship, she gave me this little book. I don't have a slideshow today, I have live artifacts. I'm not against PowerPoint, I just think we overuse it sometimes. This is an Adventist novel. It's called Project Sunlight. It tells a fictitious story of a young lady who converts to Adventism and lives through the time of trouble and is translated at the end of time. It's similar to the Left Behind approach, but it has Adventist doctrine in it, not dispensationalist doctrine. So Julie didn't give me this book to try to win me, and I've got a boom up here. I don't know, is that something I'm doing? Or, okay. You guys can hear me, right? Okay. I've run sound before. I used to run sound here. I just want to make sure I'm not, up here talking and nobody hears me, or, I'm just a distraction. Anyway, this book is about a person who converts to Adventism, goes through the end time of trouble, and is translated at the end of time. Julie gave it to me not to try to win me to Adventism. She gave it to me to get an outsider's perspective, because she had grown up in the church and that's all the perspective she had. So I read it and I told her I thought it was plausible. I was reading a lot at that time because I was traveling the southeastern United States in this band. I was playing music in somewhat might consider to be a semi-professional situation. I was a paid musician. I made a set fee per show. We were booked through a talent agency. We had a manager, we were writing music, we were recording. Our band consisted of 5 musicians, and we traveled with a sound engineer and a light show operator. We had one of those groovy 1980s custom oversized vans that transported the people that were involved in the band, and we had a 22-foot semi that moved our equipment. We owned our own instruments, of course. We owned PA, we owned lights. We had built a drum riser, and we carried our own what's called power distribution. Now, what that means is we had blown the circuits in some of the clubs that we had played because we carried so much equipment that it drew that much electricity. So we carried a circuit board on a piece of plywood that we could tie into a telephone pole so that we didn't blow the circuits in the clubs. So we could basically run a concert out in the middle of nowhere. So anyway, I was spending a lot of time riding cooped up in this van from town to town, so I read a lot. I read novels like Stanley Kubrick's 2001 science fiction series, Jurassic Park, and other Michael Crichton books, which were popular at the time. I, of course, read band biographies because I was trying to get somewhere in the music business. I read Jimmy Page, Led Zeppelin, Metallica, Fleetwood Mac. I was college educated, so I liked science books and philosophy. I had read Plato, Socrates, Aristotle, Descartes, and Stephen Hawking. And at the time, I was reading a book about chaos theory and fractal geometry because the Jurassic Park series had made that popular in the culture. So I was trying to understand that because that was just interest that I had. When Julie's brother Brian, who I know he probably appreciates me talking about him up here too, when he found out that his younger sister was dating a guy that was interested in science and playing in a band, he said, well, he's probably a pretty good convert potential, so let me see if I can show him something that he might be interested in. He gave me this book, Creation's Tiny Mystery, which is by Dr. Robert Gentry, who was an Adventist scientist. He's since passed away. He worked for the Oak Ridge National Laboratory in Tennessee, which is a U.S. government facility, and he had been tasked by his superiors to find heavy radioactive elements in the granites, which would, for them, be a good evidence for evolution. So he collected rock samples from all over the world, but the problem was he didn't find a lot of uranium or plutonium. What he found in great abundance was an element called polonium. Now, polonium only has a half-life of about 30 seconds, which means it's radiometrically dead in 3 minutes. So if the granites cooled over millions of years, they shouldn't be there. Their existence in the granites could only be possible if the rock went from liquid to solid at a minimum of about 3 minutes, but the existence of such well-preserved radio halos as he kept finding really seems to indicate that the rock was created instantaneously. So the polonium was trapped there as a fingerprint of the creation process. So I found all that very interesting, but I kind of filed it away and kept doing what I was doing. You guys can come up and look at the museum when I get done with it at the end. In 1994, a quick succession of events caused the band that I was in to fold financially. 3 of our personnel were from out of state. They went back home. The rest of us decided not to try to rebuild fully what we had. We sort of played in the clubs around here just for fun, but we didn't pursue it like we had in the past. I was in the process of getting credentials to do graphic design. I was pursuing freelance and photography more ardently, and the other guys were pursuing various other occupational ventures of their own. Within a couple of years, Julie and I decided to get married, so she got in touch with the local Adventist pastor to make arrangements. I don't know that you'll be able to see this, but how many people remember the old building on Elm Street? So this was the first church that I ever came to. It's the first Adventist church I ever attended. This is a very old directory. It predates my coming into the church. I don't even know who the pastor is in here. But Julie got in touch with Rex Riches, who was the pastor at that time. And the first thing you would notice about Rex, if you ever met him, was he had an accent. He was British, and so was my dad. So he had my attention. My dad doesn't have an accent because although he was born in England, he moved here when he was 3. But my grandmother was a London native, and she used to have relatives that would fly back and forth across the pond, as they called it in those days. And I remember being around all these people that spoke with an accent, and so Rex had an immediate draw for me. It was like talking to family. He informed Julie and I that he could perform the ceremony, but we would probably have to make plans to use another venue because the Greensboro church building was up for sale at that time. And he said it wouldn't be very likely that by our wedding date we would be able to use it. So it's funny how we wound up having the ceremony there and wound up staying 2 more years because the building didn't sell quite as quickly as they thought it would. But he contacted the High Point pastor and made contingency plans, and he got back with Julie and I and said, look, by the way, we've got it figured out. You guys have a place one way or the other, and it will not cost anything for you to use the building. Now, this made another impression on me because I remember Julie and I were discussing going to church, but we were only just so interested. When I found out that they were going to allow me to use the building for free, I thought, wow, that's really nice. Maybe we should show up so that we don't just look like freeloaders. So I wasn't necessarily opposed to attending church, but I was like a lot of people, and attending church didn't necessarily equate to subscribing to a philosophy. And, really the main reason I started going to church, if it comes right down to it, was I was pursuing graphic design. I was working with a couple of ad agencies in town. I was already doing, freelance. And I thought, the more people I know, the more opportunity there's going to be. So what could it hurt? So the first Sabbath we attended, Pastor Riches was not there. In fact, we had something like 2 or 3 Sabbaths before he showed up. On the first week that he did speak, it was kind of a divine appointment. That morning, Pastor Riches read some text from a new translation, which was a paraphrase. And during that service, he said that he was going to give it to someone who had been attending for 3 weeks, but, he wasn't there to see them. So he gave me this Bible, which is a contemporary English version. And I used it a lot at first. I was used to using the King James Version. I understood how to read that, but I wanted a modern translation to cross-reference because I was wanting to understand things just a little bit better. And it was little things like this that were impressing me. God was trying to get my attention. And I'm thankful for people like Rex Riches who reached out to me and Julie and did nice things for us on our way into the church. I remember when Violin Gallimore invited us to lunch for the first time. She asked Brian if he thought we'd accept the invitation. He was a little bit skeptical at first. And but she asked anyway, and we accepted, and hey, free food is always in the budget, right? Violin was a very kind person and a special treat for those of us who knew her. She must have done something right to have raised 2 Seventh-day Adventist Conference presidents. For those of you who don't know, Jay Gallimore, who was president of the Michigan Conference for about 27 years, he grew up here. And his brother, Steve Gallimore, was president of the Greater New York Conference, and he also grew up here. They both went to Tri-City, and they lived in this area. We probably spent most of our Sabbaths at Eulene's house for the first couple of years. She had a small group that met there about once a week, most Sabbaths. Usually her, Brian and Laura Job, my in-laws, Graham and Susie Shoemate. Graham was a close friend of my grandfather's in Reedsville. They lived very close together and kind of hung out at a country store a little bit. Ken Van Nordwick, who was the local literature evangelist, and his wife Linda and his son, they were there most weeks. Robert DeMont, who was the first person that I ever saw speak in the Adventist church, he was a regular. Sometimes other church members would float in and out, and sometimes Eulene would invite other first-time guests to her house, and the guest speaker occasionally if somebody came through town. We met most Sabbaths there, had a meal, gathered for prayer afterwards in the living room. Sometimes we would go for a hike. Sometimes we would distribute literature. These people taught me a lot about fellowship and Adventist culture. Eulene's husband, Homer, had passed away before I came into the church. He was also in the printing business, and he had a press in the basement. It was an old letter press, and Eulene invited me one day to take home some of the type, and I still have that. These are letters that spell out my name from an old printing press, and they're reversed because, it's like a stamp. And they normally sit on my desk at work, and every time I see them, I think of Eulene. I remember when our wedding date finally came, the whole church was so nice to us. Rex, of course, did the service, and I remember him asking, did you want the short, medium, or long service? Now, his wife was standing behind him going, short. And Julie and I were just trying to be polite, so we said medium. But I guess, having a British heritage, I should have known that medium meant extra long. But anyway, he talked about the Apostle Paul because my first name is Paul. Bill is a middle name, shorter version. My dad and I have the same name, so we had to have some way to tell us apart at home. I remember when the wedding date came. I also remember that Martin Coble and Brian Hall did the video for us, which I recently converted to digital, and my kids like to watch it and make fun of their parents. So back in the day. I also remember that Jan Thompson got this gigantic arch of balloons. She had gone to a wedding expo at the Greensboro Coliseum, and she was looking for ideas how to decorate. And, she always drove these quasi-sports cars. They weren't really sports cars. They were just small cars. And, she was all about trying to make something special. And I know that she must have tried to cram these balloons into her car, and there were probably some hanging out as she was driving to the church. But, she was just special. We really enjoyed the nice things that she did. As a matter of fact, all the ladies that put on our reception did such an excellent job. And I was very sad to hear when she passed away recently. But I also remember when this building was constructed and the process of architectural planning that changed from Pastor Rex Rich's round sanctuary design to Dudley Easton's more rectangular practical design. And this saved a lot of space, nearly double the seating capacity in here. And after the city told us we couldn't pave the field out there, it made the parking lot a lot more tolerable than it would have been. I remember being head of AV when we came in. Byron Zelenak and I used to trade positions. Sometimes he was head of AV for a year, I'd be head of AV for a year. And I remember the PA contractor died halfway through the installation. That made things very interesting. The balcony was actually originally designed to house the soundboard because we were going to do that as a security thing. But then the local building inspectors came in and said, hey, if you put the soundboard up there, that's a volunteer position. And what that means is you've got to make it handicap accessible. So that would mean that where the men's room is now, we'd have to have an elevator. Well, you can imagine the cost that's involved in that. And we decided, you know what, downstairs is fine. I also remember Robert Welch was always talking about how ridiculous the building code was. And I guess he would know. He was an electrical contractor. And among other things, he rewired the Four Seasons Mall at one point, so he probably had to deal with people like that all the time. I used to think Robert was crazy. I used to go to board meetings all the time and Wednesday night meetings, and he would talk about politics and sometimes eschatology, and some of the things that he said was, to me, it was very weird. But time and experience has shown me that he was actually way ahead of us. I had gotten permission from a couple of our evangelists to copy their sermons and share them. There was no internet, there was no YouTube, so I was doing what people might now call a media ministry. And I was always buying blank cassettes, blank videos. I was copying them out of my house. I had 3 or 4 VCRs. I had a 3-cassette high-speed duplicator. So one day Robert Welch dropped by my house and he had a grocery bag full of blank video cassettes and a master, which I still have. It was, and still is, an unauthorized documentary of the Oklahoma City bombing. He gave it to me prior to 9/11. So he was a conspiracy theorist. Before that was a coined word, I guess. And lest some of you hold a popular disdain for that kind of thing and think that we should be above that, allow me to just burst your Adventist bubble. Try telling some of your non-Adventist friends or relatives or just somebody off the street what we believe is the first beast of Revelation 13, or maybe the second beast, or maybe what the mark of the beast is. What do you think those people would call you? Well, they would call you a conspiracy theorist, because that is, in their eyes, what you would be. So if you've never thought about it that way, let me just welcome you to the club. So I'm very thankful for people like Robert Welch, who taught me that you need to be careful about first impressions, because people you meet that might seem a little crazy at first, they might be wisdom in disguise. And by the way, it is the fear of these stigmas, like being called a conspiracy theorist or misogynistic or xenophobic, that Ellen White seems to indicate will eventually embarrass a lot of people out of the church at the end of time and coerce them into receiving the mark of the beast, because they want to remain acceptable and fashionable among their circle of popular non-Adventist friends in the world. Fears like this have already caused people like Stephen Bohr to be practically banned in the Potomac, Doug Batchelor in the Florida Conference, and Conrad Vine and Walter Weiss to be viewed as with such disdain and even ridicule by people in our leadership. But I digress. I remember the grand opening Sabbath here in this building where Jim Davidson was the Carolina Conference president at that time. He later went on to be the Southern Union Executive Secretary. I also remember Ron Quick, who was the Carolina Conference Communications Director. He showed up that day with a Nikon D100, and he had my full attention. I know my wife probably wished I'd never had that conversation. So I asked him, how much did that camera cost? He said, $2,000. Fortunately, within about 6 months, one came out about half the cost. That's a D70. I met Ron at camp meeting about a year or so before that. And I had been downsized from a magazine that I was working for, and I was looking for another job. So he more or less interviewed me. He thought about potentially using me at the conference level. That didn't work out, but we kept in touch over the years, and I would occasionally have my photos show up in the Carolina Action or the Southern Tidings. Mostly it was Pathfinder events. Sometimes it would be big church celebrations, like Kernersville had their centennial in 2010, and High Point had their centennial in 2013. I think I had a picture of Hannah doing the groundbreaking here, and that was put in the Carolina Action. And I was asked to cover all of the stuff that happened with the TCA's new building, so I got published doing a little bit of that. But in March 2012, Ron called me and asked me if I was available to take photos for a week-long youth conference that took place here in Greensboro that was being put on by the North American Division. And that was by far the most exciting thing I've ever done, because the NAD communications team hired me. They paid me as a freelancer to go and cover that event. And I worked for 3 or 4 days doing that, and it was great fun. As you can imagine, I was very thankful to have known him, through his time at the Carolina Conference. He provided me with several opportunities to do ministry in the field of communications. I've since worked with his replacement, Becky Carpenter, who is also a very agreeable person. And I also want to mention Isaac Vallejo Sr., who was the pastor. He was the Hispanic pastor for the Greensboro district several years ago. He doesn't speak really good English, and I don't speak any Spanish. But we worked together on several occasions. He almost always used my photography to do the end of event slideshows for Pathfinder Camporees, Work Bees, Adventurer Fun Days, things like that. Someone else that I enjoyed talking photography with, and maybe some of you didn't know this, but Patrick Hicks was also a photo enthusiast. As a matter of fact, I sold him my old film camera for almost nothing when I went digital. His father had been into cameras and things like that. I remember when Patrick started playing the organ here, we were very lucky to have him. I don't know how many of you knew him, but he had a long and notable history in the Adventist Church. The story of how he outlawed high heels at Walla Walla College is very amusing. He and I spent a lot of time together in this room talking about music, photography, politics, church doctrine. He was something of a mentor, and I think I enjoyed him so much because he was a little bit eccentric, and I related to that better than most. He taught my oldest son, Matthew, piano, and this is his Suzuki book, which also has Patrick's notes in it and some of Matthew's cartoon drawings. But I keep it around because I remember Patrick. Not very long before he died, I went to visit him at his studio down in High Point, and I'll never forget, he had these two giant Steinways in this living room of this house, and his thinking was, look, when you go take guitar or violin or something like that, the teacher has an instrument and you have an instrument. So why is it that when we teach piano that the teacher doesn't have a piano and the student has a piano? Again, he was an eccentric person, but I think it almost made sense. So I went and visited him. I was down there talking photography or something with him, and Sarah, my traveling buddy, was with me. And she had been taking lessons from somebody out at TCA, and when Patrick started talking to her about piano, he was like, so show me something. So she sat down and played a little bit. She was having trouble with a song, and he gave her an impromptu lesson right there. So I'm very thankful to have known Patrick for the time that I did. But it's hard not to talk about music in this place without mentioning Patty Easton. I remember when she discovered that I played guitar when I very first came into the church, and she was very interested in getting me plugged into things. So she said, bring your guitar, I'll use you for song service. And she was a Southern gospel player, I was a rock and roll player. I just didn't hardly see how it was gonna work, but she said, bring it, and so I did. And I got the idea just right as we were getting ready to play. I said, you know what, just make sure I can see your left hand, and if I know what chords you're making, I'll just kind of follow you. So it worked, we did that a few times. But I wound up getting involved in other ministries, and as much as I enjoyed that, I had other places I needed to be. I recently discovered in my archives the 1999 Christmas program that was done in the old building, and I'm in the process of converting it to digital. I plan on having it on my YouTube within the next month so that it's there for the holiday season if anybody wants to see it. Patty and Dudley have been good friends of mine over the years, more like extended family. It's hard to believe Dudley will be 100 in the next few months. He designed this building. As a matter of fact, he designed the Winston-Salem Church building. And he did the preliminary sketches on the current TCA building. Probably he was involved in the original. As a matter of fact, he is the only remaining person, he's the only surviving person that went out looking for land to build the TCA building. Everybody else has passed away. He's the only one that knows that story anymore. He told it at the 50th anniversary in 2007. TCA in the old building had a 50th anniversary presentation. I've got video and photos of that too. And Dudley, because he was there, nobody can tell it like him. I don't know if you realize the treasure that you have in some of your people, but I've certainly come to appreciate it. I remember in 1998, our conference evangelist, Dale Pollitt, asked Martin Coble to help him video his prophecy series, and they pulled me in and asked me to help too. This was in the old building, and it was recorded to VHS. When we moved here in 2004, he came back and he did another series, and we also helped there with him too. And everybody that was involved in that project got a free set. And it was really cool because at the ending credits, he put Bill Smith, cameraman, Martin Coble, master control, and Dale Pollitt, executive producer. So I've been credited. Kind of neat. I really like Dale. He's one of my favorites. I was baptized in one of his meetings, and I'll get to that in a little bit. But I went to see him in the Clemens Church over the summer. He held a series, and I always enjoy going to see him. I also remember when Pastor Gary Moyer, who was here at that time, asked us, hey, can we start doing videos for cable television, local? How much would it cost for us to set the sanctuary up? Well, Martin did some research on that. You are still back there, aren't you? I see you. Hey, sometimes when you're up here, you're kind of in your own little world, but I wasn't sure if you had come in or not. Martin's been a great guy to work with over the years. He's used me for things, I've used him for things. It's been great. So Martin did some research, and the board looked at the figures, and they were like, yeah, I don't think we can do that. So I said, hey, why don't we do amateur video? So I got in touch with Dale, and we used one of his little switchers, and we at least made video available for people that were coming in that wanted to get a copy of the sermon. Again, this was before YouTube. I mean, this was media ministry when there was no internet. But around 2005, the internet had become something that you couldn't ignore anymore, and Gary Moyer asked me, hey, could you design a website for us? You already work in graphic design, how hard would that be? And I'll be honest with you, I wasn't sure if I could or not. Now, this was before Wix or Webador or Site123. I mean, you had to pretty much create the pages from scratch. You had to export your own HTML. And he put me in touch with a guy down at the conference. I think it was Ray Stevenson. I know it was Stevenson was the last name, but I'm not sure if it was Ray or not. But anyway, he had decommissioned an old machine that was being used as a server at that time, and there was almost nobody in the Carolina Conference that had a website. This guy had set up a web server at the conference and was using it for anybody, he was letting anybody use it for free who wanted to host a website. So he walked me through how to go to GoDaddy and reserve a domain and set up the A record to point to his server and then populate it. So this is the machine I used. It's still functional. This is a 2003 Mac iBook, and probably most of your phones have more power than this thing does now. But with the Lord, little is much, isn't that right? Again, I want to emphasize, I'm very thankful to have been able to work with these very talented individuals who have been a pleasure to serve and to serve with in the Lord's work. It isn't about me. I couldn't have built a website on my own. I mean, it required Gary's vision. It required Mr. Stevenson's guidance. I was only there to try to connect the dots that they gave me to connect. I was a willing servant to try to do what the church wanted me to do. I'm very thankful for these people and the Lord who found me useful. I remember running sound here for Jamie George one night. I didn't really know who he was. This guy came in. He was a violin player. He was an exceptional pleasure to work with, because if you've ever dealt with anybody that runs sound like Wesley and Martin back there, we get the surprise disc every day, every time we come into church, and we hope that it's going to work out right for the special music. We hope that the volume is loud enough that they can hear, all that kind of stuff. Jamie pulled out a laptop. He selected his songs. He made me a disc. They were all on level. They worked correctly. All I had to do was push a button, play, and pause the whole night. It was very, very nice. And after everyone had left, I locked up that night. So it was me and Jamie George in this room for about 20, 30 minutes. I had a private audience with the guy. And when he found out that I used to play in a band, he said, look, if you've got musical talent, you really need to continue to do that. And I said, well, I'm really busy with other things. He said, what would you play if you could play something outside of the rock and roll business? And I said, well, I might be interested in playing the cello. So he said, you should pursue that. So maybe I should have done that a little sooner than I did, but I was thankful in the spring of 2021 when my good friend Del McKray was there to encourage me to play with Scott, who was playing with us earlier. Scott has played with Jamie George on several occasions, and I'm very lucky to have a violin player that's that accomplished. We were going through some of his old violins recently, and he has one that's about this big, and it looks like a toy. You started playing when you were 3? Is that right? 4, okay. His first violin looks like a toy, but it's a functional violin. It's about that big. And I can't go into all the details right now, but my message is already too long. But Del, Louisa, and Scott have done a lot to resurrect and encourage my musical pursuits over the past couple of years. Del was a good friend, and not because I was any closer to him than anybody else. Dale was friends with everybody. And those of you who know him know that the local church has suffered a great loss when he passed away about 2 years ago. I look forward to the resurrection when I can see him again and see Scott reunited with his father to tell him how he continued to play even though it was a struggle at first. I know that it will make him very happy as they walk into eternity together. As my namesake Paul might say, time would fail me to mention people and events of the past, such as all the children's stories that I enjoyed hearing from Kay Elvis, or all the youth ministry adventures that Julie and I had in the joint venture with Ron and Daphne Lewis down in High Point. All of the print business shop talk that I've ever enjoyed with Tom Hall over the years, special music solos by Wendy Coble, my school board adventures designing the TCA logo in 2002, which was recently retired and replaced by one of my understudies, Zach Agelberger, who is a young, promising photographer. Working in the TCA Lunch Volunteer Program with Donna Landrow, who was a member here not that long ago, and 10 years of publishing the TCA Yearbook, which I could do a whole series on. But I also enjoyed watching people come in the door. I was involved in a lot of evangelism, and I remember when Hank and Anna Lane came in, Claudette and Andrew Walker, Jim and Melissa Smith, Wesley and Michelle Thorpe, and Joyce and Norberto Palacios, who now have their own church. I told them, hey, start a Sabbath school class that's a Spanish Sabbath school class, people will come. And not only did people come, but so many people come that they had to go and take it somewhere else. And again, it's not about me, it's about the Lord doing his work through whoever's available. But I want to end by recognizing someone who probably had one of the greatest influences on me, especially as I entered the denomination back in 1997. First, I want to again thank his son, Brian Heineman, for having me today. His dad, Charles, was a great mentor and friend. Now, I probably wasn't any closer to him any more than I was to Dale, any more than I was to anybody else, but Charles was just a regular guy who happened to be a pastor, and I think that's what made him so effective in my case. I remember he hadn't been here very long, and neither had I, when Dale Pollitt started an evangelistic series down in High Point. It's about February 1997. Julie and I were encouraged to attend, and as is usual for the evangelistic process, there were response cards that were passed out from night to night. So when the question of baptism came up, I checked the box for baptize, and Julie checked the box for rebaptize, because she's already been baptized previously by Kenneth Cox, which is another story. And actually, John Peters could tell you that story because he watched it. So this put Charles and Dale in a little bit of a predicament because it was kind of awkward. We needed to be baptized into the Greensboro chapter of the church, but the series was in High Point. And it might be a little bit confusing to the other baptismal candidates who would see us get baptized and then wonder why we weren't coming to church down there. They normally do baptisms at the end of the series, and although we were going to the series at night, we were still coming to Greensboro during the day, during the Sabbath afternoon, morning services. And so that was also, that posed the issue of, well, are you actually going to be there that day? So Dale Pollitt and Charles Heineman put their heads together, and they came up with a solution that worked kind of as a gimmick. We were asked if we could do the baptisms early, and we didn't even know why that was an issue, so we said, sure. And another complication was, at that time, no churches had any kind of screens. So Dale traveled with this gigantic screen that took up like the whole rostrum, and it covered up the baptistry. So what they did on the evening of March 30, 1997, which was, by the way, Easter Sunday night, is Dale gave a presentation on baptism, explaining what it is, how it worked, why people need to do it, and why you do it publicly. And right after he did the presentation, they ripped the screen down, and there we were standing in the baptistry, me and Charles and Julie. And so Dale's presentation was kind of like, this is what baptism is, it's how it works, now here's your demonstration. So we were sort of the rainmaker. I've spoke to people in High Point that said that they actually made decisions that night because they saw us get baptized. This is the steps to Christ that Charles gave me that night. Pastor Hyman Sr. took a lot of interest in me, and I don't think it was because I was more special than anybody else. He was just a pastor that was trying to work with what he had. I happened to be available. He was always nominating me for something. I started out in a social committee. I was quickly recruited for AV, youth ministry, Sabbath school. I helped with a lot of Daniel and Revelation seminars over the next few years. I was behind the scenes kind of a person. In the summer of 1999, I went in front of the camp meeting congregation on Friday evening, and I got to meet Doug Batchelor and sit with him as he was doing his presentation on how Net 99 was coming up. And so when I came back to the local church after we did that, Julie and I were on the board, and we said, hey, we ought to do Net 99. And so Pastor Charles looked at me and said, yeah, I think that's a good idea. I think you should do Net 99. And I was like, what, are you kidding me? I don't know what I'm doing. I've only just come into the church recently. He said, no, you'll do fine. So he had Brian and I out at the UNCG area looking for a place to rent. We actually found a place to rent that had previously been a Christian nightclub called the Salt Shaker. And so it already sort of had a connotation in that neighborhood that, Christian activities were going on there. So I was still in the sign business at that time, so I created a bunch of signs. We decorated the place. The conference loaned us a projector, which projectors back then, you have to understand, they were a piece of furniture practically. And we set up a downlink, and people came. We had 30 guests our first night. And although nobody was baptized from that group, I think Claudette Walker came in through the downlink at the church site because we were running 2 downlinks at the same time. Right after that happened, Robert DeMond and I did a follow-up Revelation seminar, which is where I bought from Seminars Unlimited a large print King James that has the Greek and Hebrew lexicons in the back. When I ordered them, they were the last 2 in stock. I still have it. It's the Bible I take to church every week. Pastor Charles nominated me to go to Carolina Conference constituency in 2001, where I got to see the process of how our conference officials are elected. I got to meet Jack Blanco, the author of The Clear Word. That was very cool. Charles also nominated me to go to lay pastoral training in 2000, which gave me a better understanding of the role of pastors and elders in the local church. The instruction was given by Ron Halverson, who wrote Gangs to God. I remember Charles and Linda coming to see Julie and I at the hospital when my son Matthew was born and visiting us in our little apartment a few days later. And of course, he did the dedication a couple of weeks after that, or 3 or 4, whatever the timeline is. Linda Heineman was very kind. When Julie was expecting, Linda bought material to make baby blankets for Matthew and Jacob, your current pastor's son, who's grown up and doing ministry all on his own. And although it's well worn, I still have it. Linda made that when she had cancer. It was not long before she died. And it wasn't too long after that Pastor Hyman moved away, went to another district. And I remember seeing him at camp meeting a couple of years later. And then sometime after that, a person told me that he had passed away also. So I was very thankful to know them both. They were a big part of my first impressions coming into what was at that time this strange new world of Adventism. Pastor Charles Hyman and Linda were some of the best examples of what Adventism should look like. And I'm sure they made mistakes. No one's perfect, and I know I saw them both through the eyes of someone who was new to the faith, relatively uneducated about our doctrines, and inexperienced in the ways of Adventist culture. But I tell you what I did see. Jesus was their Lord, and wisdom has justified their children. And there is no doubt in my mind but that they will both be in the kingdom, and I look forward to seeing them in the resurrection. If your current pastor is anything like his father, you have a good one. Again, I'd like to thank the district for having me. Maybe I can schedule a return to give the actual backstory. And although I know I didn't mention everyone here by name, just be comforted that everyone I've ever experienced in the Greensboro district has a very special place in my heart. Of that you can be sure. God bless.